This week's blog post is the 14th in my series on the history of outdoor sculpture in New York City, and it wraps up the series. This series of blog posts has highlighted the most important of the outdoor sculptures in New York City and provided some historical and art historical context. This is the final post. To read the others, you can click on the New York City sculpture tag on my website. It's this URL here. For photos of all outdoor sculptures in New York City in chronological order, visit my Instagram page, which is this right here. Posts 1 through 7 looked at the subjects of outdoor sculptures in the order in which they appeared. In the first, we saw sculptures of animals and politicians. In the second, we saw our first military and literary heroes. The third post included a list of memorials to the Civil War, and the fourth post covered figures active before 1800, including founding fathers. The fifth was on businessmen, the sixth was on figures in the arts, and the seventh included allegorical figures through 1918. The next 4 posts in the series looked at sculptors who were famous in New York City and throughout America. John Quincy Adams Ward, that's his work on the left. Augustus St. Gaudens, this is his. Frederick McMonnies, this is his, and Daniel Chester French. In the 12th and 13th posts, we looked at an assortment of sculptures that showed the same subject as in the 1st through 7th posts, but how they differed after World War I. In this post, we wrap up the series by looking at a few abstract works, and then at some of my favorite outdoor sculptures in New York City. Just a brief overview. I've been compiling a database of outdoor sculptures in New York City since 2001. It includes works that are on public property, as well as works that stand on private property but are visible to the public. Here are the current numbers from the database. From 1850 to 1900, 98 sculptures were erected outdoors in New York City. From 1901 to 1950, 233 sculptures were erected. This includes standalone monuments, such as St. Gaudens' Sherman, a plethora of sculptures associated with City Beautiful architecture, and 79 busts in the Hall of Fame of Great Americans in the Bronx. From 1951 to 2021, 101 representational sculptures were erected. Among them are 21 busts in the Hall of Fame, the last of which was added in 1973. So our conclusion is that representational sculpture is no longer the preferred means of honoring remarkable people or of architectural decoration. All right, let us look briefly at abstract works. The American public was introduced to modern art, including abstract art, just before the outbreak of World War I by the Armory Show of 1913. I've given you links to some articles on that. During the 1920s, avant-garde American artists such as Isamu Noguchi began to create abstract works. To their distress, they found that wealthy people who grew up surrounded by the works of John Quincy Adams Ward, Daniel Chester French, and Augustus St. Gaudens would not pay well, or at all, for non-representational works. The Museum of Modern Art, established in 1929 in New York City, eventually changed that. Abstract works came to have not only critical acclaim, but public attention and wide acceptance. The earliest abstract works standing outdoors in New York date to the 1960s. Many were decorative elements, punctuation at street level for the boxy glass and chrome skyscrapers of the international style. For example, in 1961, Noguchi was commissioned to create a sunken garden for Chase Manhattan's headquarters in the financial district. He used 7 large basalt rocks from Japan, resting on a couple thousand white marble blocks, to which he added 3 fountains. I can't give you a picture of that because the Noguchi estate is very, very fussy about publishing pictures of his stuff. Abstract works also began to appear on the grounds of institutions such as the United Nations, Lincoln Center, Columbia University, and New York University. So here's a selection of works from the 1960s. On the left is a sculpture by Alexander Calder. The title means the ticket box, the ticket seller's office. That's at Lincoln Center. On the right is another piece at Lincoln Center by Henry Moore. On the left on this one is a sculpture at Astor Place in Manhattan called Alamo. No, there is not a person living inside. That's a hoax. On the right is Isamu Noguchi's Red Cube, 1967. Presumably the Noguchi estate has not complained about this picture because there's significant other stuff in it. On the left is a Pablo Picasso sculpture called Bust of Sylvette. It's at NYU. And on the right is Fritz Koenig's The Sphere, 1969, which stood in front of the World Trade Center. The earliest non-representational work created with public funds seems to be Alan Sonfist's Time Landscape of New York, proposed in 1965 and unveiled in 1978. This environmental public sculpture, also called a living sculpture or a social sculpture, is a 25 by 40 foot plot intended to show 3 stages of forest growth, from grasses to saplings to grown trees, using plants native to New York City in colonial times. According to Wikipedia, New York's post-colonial plants keep rudely insisting on intruding on the site. Sonfist, the artist, has stated that he doesn't mind, but the New York City Parks Department periodically pulls the intruders out and incinerates them. I am not a fan of abstract art. You can see my post on Christo's Gates for that. So I have not focused on tracking abstract works in my sculpture database. But by my count, more than 70 abstract works stand in publicly accessible places in Manhattan. In the outer boroughs, there are probably somewhat fewer, since there are fewer skyscrapers to be punctuated out there. Rather than concluding with abstract works, I'm going to leave you with a group of my favorite sculptures since the mid-19th century, just to remind you of how beautiful and evocative representational sculpture can be. Note, unless you are a clone of me and have been secretly living the exact same life as I have, these are not going to be the same as your own favorites. To make your own list, go to my Instagram page and flip through the chronological sequence. So, the sculptures that are my favorites, with very brief comments on why. Washington at Union Square, because it reminds me of the values and principles for which Americans fought the Revolutionary War. Lafayette at Union Square, an elegant rendition of the wealthy marquis who made a major difference in the American Revolution. Farragut, Madison Square, foursquare in ship shape as he leads his men into a naval battle, and the pedestal is brilliant innovation. On the left, Nathan Hale in City Hall Park for the Defiance. Center, Hamilton, near Hamilton Grange. I think this is the most elegant and energetic of the 4 outdoor sculptures of Alexander Hamilton in New York City. And Beethoven on the right in Prospect Park for the slight smile on the face of a musical genius. On the left, Erickson, a New Yorker going about his business, which happens to be designing an innovative warship. In the center, Sherman. The billowing cape reminds me of superheroes. And he was an amazing military strategist. On the right, the continents at Bowling Green, because they're the most complex and thought-provoking allegorical sculptures in New York City. On the left here, the Untermire Fountain, one of the most light-hearted sculptures in all of New York City. In the center, the main monument, because it's a reminder of the time when the United States still had moral certitude of its own value. And on the right, the Glory of Commerce at Grand Central Terminal, a reminder that business requires both mental and physical effort. On the left here, the Strauss Memorial, because the memory of those we've lost should eventually not be painful. In the center is Christopher Columbus at Dorian Murphy Square in the Bronx, my favorite New York City sculpture of the courageous explorer because of its thoughtful expression. And on the right, from the Channon Building at Lexington Avenue and 42nd, the lobby reliefs that show virtues needed for success. On the left is the Francis Hodgson Burnett Memorial in Central Park. I really love the way it captures the concentration of a pair of children on what they're doing. And on the right, Charging Bull at Bowling Green, because New York City never stays down for long. And finally, Socrates and Frederick Douglass as reminders that imaginative, highly trained sculptors are still at work. And that's it for our history of outdoor sculpture in New York City. Next week we will move on to something completely different. DianeDuranteWriter.com has hundreds of posts on sculpture, painting, and my other obsessions. To join the free Sunday Recommendations email list, visit the URL that's on the screen or email me. And you can say, "Well done, Diane," or support my work and receive rewards by means of the tip jar on DianeDuranteWriter.com. As always, thank you for listening.